Not of trans women, but of men abusing the ability to identify as women to get access to fear-mongering.
And this is one of the issues that I take with you. You talk about science. I ask you, where's the evidence? You give me an anecdote. What a masculine man is today, I mean, I don't know, think Vin Diesel. I think many kinds of masculine man, but just think Vin Diesel, right? A lot of these people are TERFs, you know? A lot of these people were...
Okay, well, I would say TERF is a slur, but...
TERF is absolutely not a slur.
Very happy to get the chance to speak with you. I know you are a big fan of mine. You posted a video on your YouTube channel titled Transphobe Debunks Herself on the Joe Rogan Experience. So first thing, is gender a social construct?
Yes, absolutely.
And what is your evidence for that?
Well, if we acknowledge that sex and gender are distinct categories, which of course, you know, we invent the words, we can decide their meanings if we choose to, with sex being a biological distinction, you know, highly bimodal, of course, with distributions ranging strongly towards male or female with some intersex people, and gender as a collection of social rules and expectations associated with sex. I think that the social construction becomes clear when we attempt to discreetly categorize these distinctions. Very much like race, which is broadly accepted to be a social construct. No one denies that there are biological elements to race. White people have, of course, lighter skin on average than black people. It's been known to happen. But where we draw those lines, you know, well, do we separate North and South Africans? You know, is the Mediterranean a distinct racial category? That's a social thing. Likewise, for the longest time, we've decided there are two genders here in the West, you know, social categories distinguished exclusively by sex. But of course, there are other cultures where that's simply not the case. It's not to say it's not informed by biology, only that it's not solely determined by it. There is a social construction there.
Right. So I agree with you in that I don't think gender is entirely biological. I do agree with you that sex and gender are different things, but in terms of the biological aspect, in terms of what is considered masculine or feminine in society may be socially constructed, but whether someone gravitates to what's considered masculine or feminine is dictated by biology in terms of the prenatal environment and in terms of testosterone exposure.
I definitely think there's a truth to that.
Agree with that? Okay.
Certainly. Though what is masculine and feminine, of course, can vary massively culture to culture. You know, like in imperial China, there was a practice of women binding their feet to make them all small. And, you know, I can understand from a biological perspective how a fetishization of petiteness in women could be a kind of recurring theme throughout different cultures. But suffice to say, I don't think that's a recurring trend we see nowadays, say, for example, in, you know, modern LA, you know, the practice of feet binding, making people look more feminine. I hope not. It was pretty unhealthy back then.
I'm kidding.
Yeah, maybe it is, you know, God knows these days. But so, you know, maybe there are the hormone washes that you undergo in vitro, I think affect significantly what your preferences in life are going to be on later. But a lot of that feeds into a sort of cultural preconception of what it means to be a woman or a man, you know, both in a social and in a biological sense. And I think that people feed into that. It turns into a kind of feedback loop where, you know, you go back 1,000 years and people were doing wild stuff to demonstrate their masculinity or their femininity, you know, like they wanted to. It felt like it was like a drive, but nowadays we've no such desire. And I think we construct the categories that we're sort of driven to walk within to an extent. And that's, in a sense, I think it recurs a little bit.
So when you say that, do you mean maybe society pushes people to veer off in one direction or the other?
Yeah, I think so. What a masculine man is today, I mean, I don't know, think Vin Diesel. I think many kinds of masculine man, but just think Vin Diesel, right? You know, Vin Diesel as an archetype wasn't around in ancient Greece, but men were, and testosterone was. You know, I think that today there are men with a strong biological predisposition towards achieving something, and when they want that something, they look at media and they say, oh, well, Vin Diesel is a guy I can look at. You know, that's an archetype worth pursuing. That option wasn't available back 2,500 years ago, so maybe there are different avenues. You know, they would look at the legends of Achilles. And, you know, I'm not a great scholar of the classics, but yeah, I think to an extent, you know, and maybe the masculinity, the underlying testosterone, the hormone washes, they drive both of those things. But obviously, we play a huge hand in determining where that road goes.
Right, and I do think it's important that people have that ability to choose.
You know, trans women don't go around arguing that they're biologically the same as cis women.
But I have seen some activists saying that they are biologically female or they are biologically male because they identify as that sex.
Look, I may be a biological female. I'm a biological female in my 30s. Mia?
So your point about race, I'm curious to understand, because I'm sure people in my audience, when they hear race is a social construct, they'll say, what? And so that was initially my my first reaction as well. But I'm curious to hear, so are there not some biological correlates, say with medical predisposition differences that do link to biology?
Of course. I think a good example would be sickle cell anemia. There are definitely some dispositions, though a lot of them are more cultural than people might think. For example, the lactose intolerance difference between Western Europeans versus Southeast Asians, I think, can be attributed, at least in large part, to the availability of and cultural predisposition to lactose products over the centuries and the gut bacteria we build up. When biologists study what we call colloquially race, they talk about clines, hundreds of discrete genealogical spectrums that range geographically across the globe, and what we talk about when we say race, in a broader sense, really is just determined by skin color and maybe a couple of facial features that people's eyes tend to draw to, because that's what we can see, we can identify. But those are actually really bad markers for genetic differentiation. So if you were really studying in depth how humans are constructed, it's mostly geographic. You take somebody from one part of the world, move them to the other, in a couple hundred years, their children are going to be much more genetically similar to the people of that environment, just as a product of a ton of factors, related to culture and environment and temperature and what have you. And it's so infinitely complicated. We see so little of it. I feel in a way gender is kind of similar. We have these social constructions, but there are many different types of men, right? I grew up in right next to West Hollywood, which is a thriving gay community. And
hooray.
Right. And when you're near gay communities, you notice there's, I wouldn't call it a binary, but there's definitely a strong divide between some of the more masculine and some of the more feminine men, and the whole dating rituals that go along with it. I'm into men, so it's to a degree of participated in this. And it's not at all difficult to imagine a society in which that could have been categorized as a third gender. You have masculine men, or tops, or what have you, and they're categorized in one direction. Then you have the other, more bottomy feminine men, and people it would have been a gender trinary, and people would have found ways to get angry about that. But we construct a lot of this stuff. I encourage people to be, I suppose, open-minded, the idea that things could have been different.
Yeah, because I guess I see it as the most simple or the most straightforward way to look at it is just to simply say they're men and they're women. And if there can be deviation within that, but at the end of the day, you're still a man or woman. For the vast majority of us, 99% of us plus, we are men or women, and we identify as our birth sex. So I see that as the most simple, straightforward way to do it.
Sure, but we shouldn't limit the range of human expression based purely on simplicity. Just because we have a preference towards our gender binary system doesn't mean it's inherently any more valid. I'm fine with social deconstructionism in a variety of ways. I'm going to crunch this a little bit over. I'm going to really quickly include the Italian flag. Who else is being excluded? Japan, okay? There we go. We need Japan in here. The poly flag as well. It's ugly. You're right. Who else are we excluding? Gamers? I feel like the gamer flag has to be like the Joker face, and it has to be like right here. Foot fetish. There we go. The Irish. The Irish. There we go. So long as it's serving, the idea that it benefits humans, that it makes us happy. And as far as I can tell, both today in the modern world and across a variety of cultures, it wasn't sufficient to simply say, oh, well, this person's a feminine man or what have you, As we construct these categories, as we delineate where we decide to draw these lines, the only real concern, at least to me, is what makes people happy, We're not really talking about hurting people here. When we reconceptualize these ideas, people often talk about this, the destruction of the gender binary. Well, you take non-binary people, and I ask, what harm is being done? Certainly nothing that can be measured in a graph. It's this ephemeral, well, what of our traditions? And I don't really care about those. I just care about freedom. I mean, go hog wild.
Right. And I agree with you in that. I think people should be free to express themselves however they like and be happy and live their life and not be bothered by other people or not be judged. But sex is determined by gametes, and gender identity is determined by biological sex for over 99% of us. Then where is the third gamete that would suggest there is a gender in between men and women?
Because it's only determined for 99% of us, well, first of all, even if it was just the 99%, the existence of 1% constitutes millions of people. But even within that, we constructed the categories to perfectly match sex. So of course there's going to be a near one-to-one correlation with sex. Are you of the opinion that color is socially constructed?
Do you mean visual color? Or you
Visual
mean
color,
race?
the optical perception, yes.
Socially constructed. As far as I know, it's a biological process.
I agree. It's the wavelengths that we see. Of course, you have people with vision abnormalities, which see different colors. But
Right.
we have an understanding of what a properly working eyeball can see, and we have a good understanding of what wavelengths correspond to which subjective experiences of color. But of course, if you take a look at the history of color and language across the world, different cultures have different conceptions of what is or isn't green or blue. There's no hard line, of course, between what a green or a blue is. It's totally arbitrary. It's literally a spectrum. So the line is drawn differently depending on the linguistic preconceptions of the culture that you're looking at. For the most part, we've sort of nailed out the ideas here, but if you take a look historically, like which ideas of color developed first, where are these lines drawn, you get really interesting and very diverse ideas. And of course, this is factual, this is biological. Wavelength is something that we can measure out and parse mathematically. So it's not like we're exclusively dealing with subjective human experience. And yet, the categories we draw, how many colors are there in the wheel? Are there 5, 8, 10? We say they're functionally infinite, but we only have so many words, and most people separate it into a discrete range of colors associated with the rainbow. At least that's the historical archetype that people draw towards most easily. But that doesn't include all the colors. It doesn't include purple, for example. I guess the point that I'm getting at here is that there's not a contradiction between a biological underpinning and a complete arbitrariety of the overlying concept. The biology is the foundation, but the house you build atop it is very much of your own design.
I can see that to some extent, but with vision, it's still, perception is still to some extent, it's not as subjective to me as how you feel about your gender. That is purely subjective in terms of their self-report of that, right? It's not marked in anything objective, and that's where I have an issue with it, because to me, it just always comes back to what is evidence-based, what's in the data. When people start straying from that, it makes me wonder, well, why, and what is the purpose of that? And it's fine if people just want to say that's how they feel, but when they start to say that this is what science shows, when it doesn't, that's my concern.
Well, I don't think people speak to science there. People who talk about gender expression are talking about subjective experience, because the social roles are what they're talking about. If people were fussing about with the biology of sex, that's your one thing. But, you can ask people, take 5 people with different shades of blue on their shirts, and you put them in a room, how many color shirts are being worn today? Will you get an answer of 5 distinct for subtle color shades, 1, 2, or will people say that it's all the same shirt color fundamentally? It can even change depending on the time of day. Some people say their eyes are blue when they wake up and green when they fall asleep. A lot of that's a trick of the light, but that's a perceptive thing. And of course, gender, being a construction of social expectation, is itself, to an extent, a perceptive thing. I guess at the end of the day, I think that the fixation with scientific categorization with something as arbitrary as gender will be seen in the long run as obsolete as what we've done with race. Nowadays, biologists speak of clines, the actual underlying genealogical threads, not the overlying categories. And I think that for the most part, biologists are doing the same now with sex, where they're recognizing sex itself even as a bimodal biological construct determined by a variety of underlying threads. And the gender stuff, I think, we should just leave to the purview of social identity. I have as much interest, I think, in the scientific legitimacy of a person being a woman in a gender sense as them being a gamer, or a pothead. You could measure perhaps some genealogical association, but I think it's an identity first and foremost and should be treated as such.
So how would you define, what is a woman?
I would say that woman is sort of a social archetype that people choose to adopt, like a kind of like an identifier that they want to be known by. Obviously, there's a lot of conflation here because people get assigned this, that, the other at birth, which means that you sort of grow up with a set of roles and definitions before you're old enough to have any opinion on the subject, really. But at least when we're talking about, gender as an identity, what people care about when they're older, that's what I think of. It's like being a woman. What does it mean to be a woman? It's how you think of yourself and how you want the world to think of you. It's a sandwich board slung around your neck with a set of identifiers that you want to be considered by. I think people do this with a lot of things, not just gender, but I think gender is sort of the big one.
Look at what's happening in prisons. Look at what's happening
in
terms
prisons.
of where people are being housed in, say, hospitals, and women are now vulnerable to sexual assault as a result of this because people are self-identifying.
Where's the evidence of that happening?
Of the hospital in the UK, there was a case of a woman who was on a women's ward, and she reported a rape, and they said, oh, that didn't happen because there are only women on this ward. And then they went back and they actually found through security footage that there was actually a trans woman staying on the ward during that time. And so this woman had indeed been allegedly raped.
And so I'm not saying that trans women are predators. Well, but this is something that also, we're seeing is much more is going to be much more common.
Well, with respect, absolutely not.
With all due respect, that's not the way it works.
Not of trans women, but of men abusing the ability to identify as women to get access to
fear-mongering. And this is one of the issues that I take with you. You talk about science. I ask you, where's the evidence? You give me an anecdote.
So it's a great anecdote.
Where's the evidence of this? Well, it will happen.
What was the anecdote, though?
That one instance
this was reported in the news. This was reported in the news.
Rapes happen everywhere. One instance is not an evidence of a pattern. We don't have evidence that letting trans women into cis women's prisons will increase sexual assault. To my knowledge, there's no evidence of that upticking in an actual, like, here's a percentage, then here's a change percentage sense. We do know that trans women who go to men's prison are like 9 times as likely to be raped. So purely from a harm reduction perspective, and this goes the same with the bathrooms and the hospitals and what have you, putting trans women in the same spaces as men is demonstrably dangerous, whereas putting them in the same spaces as women is circumstantially dangerous, so far only looking at given accounts or one specific bit or another.
But does that not matter that women's safety is being placed at risk as a result of that?
By putting trans women in men's prisons? I agree completely.
And why is it... What would you say to someone who's lost their job as a result of activists harassing them and putting pressure on their institution to fire the person?
Well, I know Libs of TikTok is doing plenty of that work right now. So if it was a victim of their thing, I would say I'm sorry for the harassment you've gotten.
Well, okay, but let's not make it an even across the board thing, right? What would you, it's serious. If someone loses their job because they're pursuing research that they are genuine, it's not hateful. They're just genuinely interested in wanting to know what the truth is, and they lose their job because they ask the question. Is that fair?
As a socialist, there are plenty of people in my ideological tradition who have legitimately lost their jobs due to the questions they felt worth asking. In my experience, 99% of the time when I see somebody in academia who is fired for the boldness of the research, they were a shit academic with very strong formed political conceptions that were influencing their work, and they realized they could make more money being a social figure or a public advocate for their political positions than remaining within academia. Jordan Peterson recently did this, an entirely unremarkable man in terms of his academic contributions. He got famous for lying about Bill C-16 in Canada, and since then has made his way as a self-help guru. And now, of course, he makes far more money doing that than he ever could acting as a professor. But when he was on his way out, he published a big article about how academia's left him behind and he wasn't allowed to do X or Y and blah-de-blah. And to be honest, I don't really buy it. It's an origin myth, a creation story. Why are you out here spreading the gospel? Well, it's because academia couldn't handle the truth. Well, what was the truth? And then you look and, well, I think that sociologists and biologists have mostly free reign to determine what they're interested in looking at.
You can continue what you were saying here. I was hoping that this conversation was going to be cordial, but you can go ahead with the point you were making in my case. What were you going to say?
Oh, wait, am I speaking about, I'm not speaking about you. I was speaking about Jordan Peterson. I'm not familiar.
After you finished talking about Jordan, I thought you were making a point about me. So
no, my apologies. I didn't mean to imply that. No, I'm not familiar with the work that you did. I know what you did. I'm not familiar with the actual research you've done. In my experience, it's very difficult to ascertain the sincerity of people's claims to that effect with regards to censorship or the effects of political activism or what have you. Now, does it happen? The answer is undeniably yes, it does. But I don't know if it happens along a line or through a pattern substantial enough to verify the conspiratorial belief that the output of these institutions must be weighted heavily and distorted by the effects of activism, if that makes any sense. A lot of these people are TERFs, you know? A lot of these people were...
Okay, well, I would say TERF is a slur, but...
TERF is absolutely not a slur. It's not a discriminatory characteristic. It's only a smear against a person's political affiliation, which, I mean, you might as well say Nazi is a slur if we're going down that road. I mean, I do mean it with all negativity intended, but not a slur. Nothing against women. There are TERF men that I've talked to, and they're fun too. Anyway, no.
I don't know why that label is necessary. I feel like we can have the discussion without having to insult people.
It's what they are. I could call them transphobes, which they also are, which I would also
Well, that's also an insult, right?
Well, right. Well, you can't say TERF is a slur. Yeah, it's an insult, sure, but I find their positions insulting. They exist in a manner which I think hurts marginalized people. I mean, you wouldn't take issue with somebody being called racist if they were racist, right?
But racist is more of a descriptive term, whereas transphobic, or I feel like any disagreement with this narrative gets you labeled as something disparaging.
This is also what racists say when you impose the narrative of racial equality on them. I mean, that's what everyone says, right? It's like, well, you're insulting me by accusing me of being bigoted, and I'm not bigoted. I'm only disagreeing with this new trend. Well, that's what every bigoted group is saying.
But many things that are not coming from a place of hating trans people are being lumped in as being hateful.
So it's not about hate. Bigotry doesn't have to be about hate. There are plenty of people who don't hate black people who are nonetheless racist.
Do you want to share any final thoughts with my audience before we say goodbye?
Yeah, I guess And
I really thank you for coming on my podcast. I feel like there's something more you want to say.
There's always something more I want to say. Don't tell me that. Don't give me permission.
Trans men don't exist. Trans people don't exist. Of course, men and women should be held to stereotypical roles. So I think women should be in the kitchen having babies and, you know, not being allowed to have a vocation at all. My goal with anything I do in my work as a journalist is to just try to work against people and in terms of their ability to make informed choices.
The N-words of Europe.